just magically gone quiet at the beginning of the panel sessions, precisely on time, and I think that indicates the level of expectation of this debate, which I guess is good news, at least for me as the moderator. I don't know how the debaters feel about that, but clearly there's a lot of interest in this issue. I noticed that there are a good many academics in the room. Let me just be clear, this session is being videoed, which is why I'm not standing up to speak to you. If I stand up, apparently I go off the camera, even me, and I'm short. So for that reason, I'm going to remain seated, and all of the panelists and the experts will also remain seated, but it's for the sake of the video. The good news for the academics in the audience is that means it will be available as teaching material fairly soon, I think. This is the second of the debates which we've run at World Travel Market. Last year we looked at whether tourism was doing enough to benefit local communities. This year we wanted to shift to what is arguably the biggest challenge that confronts the travel and tourism industry, which is the carbon emissions issue. For me, I have found it more useful now to talk about carbon pollution rather than greenhouse gases. It'll be interesting to see what kind of language emerges during the debate. I am going to try to keep people to time, which may become an irksome process. I apologise if it does. We've agreed the rules for this debate very clearly between the two sides. Basically, Matt will begin by putting the case for the industry. Paul Peters will then put the case against the industry, and then we'll go into a debate which will go through the three main areas, starting with accommodation, going on to look at other forms of ground transportation, including cruising, and ending with the aviation issue. It's important to remember, sorry, you want me to do aviation first, don't you?
Yes.
We're going to do aviation first. I will follow the script. We will do aviation first, followed by accommodation, followed by the other issues. But it is important that this debate does not become totally dominated by the aviation issue. It isn't only about aviation. The issue extends further than that. So, the first thing I wanted to do was to take a show of hands on who supports the motion, and those who don't support the motion, we will assume oppose it. So, the motion for debate is that the travel and tourism industry is not taking sufficient responsibility for reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. Who agrees with that proposition? This is the case against the industry. Can we just take a show of hands on those people who think the industry is doing enough? We have a fair number of undecideds, that's clear. We have 3 or 4 brave people in the audience and a lot of undecideds. But I'm not going to take up any more of your time. I'm going to ask Matt Gorman, who's the Chair of Sustainable Aviation, in 5 minutes in an opening statement to put the case for the industry. So Matt, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Harold, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event. And as Harold said, it's great to see the turnout here. As Harold said, I'm here today as Chair of Sustainable Aviation, which, for those of you that don't know, is a unique coalition of the UK's airlines, airports, aircraft engine manufacturers, which is driving a strategy towards sustainability. That's not my full-time job, which is at Heathrow Airport, but I'm here today representing Sustainable Aviation. So the question, is the travel and tourism industry taking responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions? I mean, my simple answer to that is I believe strongly that we are, yes. And actually, I believe we have to take responsibility, like any sector, to tackle our emissions. I suppose one of the interesting things about the travel and tourism industry is that our sector depends on it. Not only are we a contributor to, but in some of the destinations that we serve around the world, a potential victim of climate change as well. So I believe strongly we are taking responsibility. Does that mean we can rest on our laurels and the job's done? Absolutely not. We need to continue to focus on and to drive progress. But with the help of the 3 witnesses I've got here today that I'll introduce as we go through, I'll aim to demonstrate that I think we are taking responsibility and we have clear plans into the future to continue to take responsibility. Just before I give a quick overview though, of the climate issue, I think it's worth saying something up front on what I think a sustainable travel and tourism industry looks like. And I use that word sustainable advisedly because it's not just about environment. For me, sustainability is about enhancing the benefits of the industry, but at the same time meeting tough environmental targets. It's not about having one or the other, it's about having both at the same time. And on that note, I'll say up front, personally, I'm a passionate believer in the wealth that travel and tourism brings. And I suspect actually talking to this audience at the World Travel Market, I imagine many travel and tourism industry professionals, I suspect many in the audience will share that view. And I use the word wealth advisedly. It is economic wealth, yes, and we know the statistics about the $735 billion of tourism receipts in the world. In 2006, a third of those to the developing world. So economic wealth, but it's more than that. It's cultural wealth. It's about how the travel and tourism industry allows us to explore the world, learn about different cultures. We're here in London, just a couple of stops from the Olympics, one of the huge cultural events that I think define our global society. Imagine, would an event like that really have been possible without the global air transport network we have today? And it's social wealth, visiting friends and family around the world. I do think that travel is fundamentally a good thing. And I just can't foresee any vision of a sustainable future in which people's freedom to travel is fundamentally curtailed. But actually, I'm an equally passionate believer that we need to tackle our environmental impacts. And as Harold said, climate change really is the key global environmental issue. We've got to take a responsibility as a sector to limit emissions, play our role in avoiding dangerous climate change. So what we're really going to aim to show you today and to convince you, and we clearly have got a job to convince you, judging by that show of hands, but to convince you that actually delivering the benefits of travel and tourism but also reducing emissions isn't a zero-sum game. Just quickly on the three topics we're going to cover. We won't be aviation dominated, but equally flights do represent the industry's single biggest contribution to climate change, about 40% of tourism emissions according to the World Tourism Organization. The global aviation sector is the first, as far as we're aware, to commit to a long-term goal out to 2050 to reduce emissions. We've set a target to reduce net emissions by 50% by 2050. Jonathan will talk more about that, but that's backed by all of the world's airlines, airports, manufacturers. It's not just about flights, though, as we said. People stay when they're on holiday. Stephen will talk about some of the steps the hotel industry is taking. And, of course, people don't just travel by plane. They travel on the ground. Increasingly, they travel on cruise holidays as well. And James will talk about some of the steps that we're taking there. But I come back to my opening message. Are we taking responsibility? I believe that we are. I believe that there's more to do. But I believe that we can achieve that balance of enhancing the benefits that the industry brings, tackling our environmental impacts, and delivering a sustainable industry. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Matt, and that was in fact way short of 5 minutes. So
was it?
Thank you very much indeed. That's much appreciated. Paul Peters, who's an Associate Professor in Sustainable Transport and Tourism at NHTV, Breda University of Applied Sciences in Holland, but who did come here today by Eurostar, of course, is going to put the case against the industry and to outline his case in an opening statement.
Presentation. Okay. I just wait until
that one.
I think so, and then the first one. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, thanks for the opportunity to be here to tell this story about why the sector, to our ideas, is not really taking the responsibility. The point is that the main statement says, is it taking responsibility? But if you read further into the web announcement of this happening, then you see, is it doing enough? Which may be a difference. And you could discuss if you take responsibility, if not doing enough, if that is taking responsibility at all. But that's semantics. At least to our ideas, the answer is no. Certainly to the second question, there is of course a lot of taking responsibility. There are a lot of activities that go to reducing emissions, but it's not enough. And furthermore, we think that probably the sector will not be really able to do it just on its own. So you will need not only the customers, but specifically also the government. And as we see, for example, the fierce discussion around ETS, from other continents. It's not really helping to get such an emission trading system, which is just the first step to get it into the air, literally. Well, what is the challenge? If you look at this graph, these two graphs, then those give you the total emissions in the world along a timeline up to the end of this century. That might both be a kind of sustainable development with respect to climate change, which means that we avoid dangerous climate change, which is more than 2 degrees rise of the temperature. At the same time, you see the emissions and the projections of those for the tourism sector as a whole rising and even crossing them somewhere near 2050. So that means, for instance, that offsetting is out of the question after that date, because what to offset? There is nothing left. But also, of course, this scenario is impossible just mathematically. And politically, it will also be not possible to go along these lines. The shares of tourism currently are not that high, but it is the future and the dynamics that are the big problem. And like it or not, but aviation is the main problem. It's not the only one. So it's good that we talk also about accommodations and other elements of tourism. But still, if you look at carbon dioxide emissions, it's already 40% of the total for the tourism sector in 2005. That will rise, that share, in the future and quite quickly. If you look at the real impact on climate change, which is represented by radiative forcing, then we get all sorts of other non-carbon effects from aviation specifically, and the share goes up by that, could be even up to 80–90% at the moment, and it's still rising. Another issue that's often mentioned is, will aircraft technology or will technology in general save us from everything? So we can just do as we do and technology will solve the problem. And I'm afraid it's not. Though the aviation industry has done a tremendous job since the first jets. If you put them on a fuel efficiency of 100, they have saved 70% based on that number already by the year 2000. However, often people think that is a kind of a constant percentage per year of gain, but it's not. In the beginning it was much faster, it was like 6–7% per year, and now it's petering out at 1.5%, and if you draw this kind of regression line, there is an end to it, and there is a reason for that, because we are reaching already the limits of physical laws, and we cannot change them, we cannot change those laws. We have to live with them. This regression line is also true. Oh, sorry, there was one other thing. Actually, when the jets were introduced, they did not such a good job. Economically, they did, but the last big piston-powered aircraft were much more efficient than the first jets. And now we are doing better, of course, in the meantime. New aircraft, as you can see, are on this regression line, so there is not much hope from the newest aircraft that are just coming out. This is the target from the industry, so that's, well, ambitious, let's say. And this is where we should go. So the target is the ambition you should have. I won't disagree, or I do not disagree with that. Another solution might be found in biofuels. And of course there is potential in biofuels, but there are also emerging now several problems. And well, look for example at the case of Jatropha. 5 years ago, only 5 years ago, everyone was talking about the wonder bean, and it turned out to be a disaster for local communities, for agriculture. There was a problem with food. The production of oil was much lower than expected. So yeah, well, that was just one example. Now algae are a big issue, but so far, okay. So far, it's at a life cycle analysis, it's not doing that well. The bests are at 15%, but mind you, if we grow the industry and we have to reduce by 80%, and the biofuels can do 85%, then there is not much room for growth here. Of course, there is technology still, so that helps. Where to go? if you economically try to optimize the future under constraints of carbon dioxide, then actually there are two ways to solve the problem. Or we keep flying as we do now, but then we have to leave the car at home. Or we fly like we did in the 1970s. It's not zero, certainly not. It's a big and huge network, but it's much less than now, and we can keep the car. That's more or less what comes out from just from the mathematics of the scenarios. So taking responsibility, well, I don't think so. Chances the sector reduces the emissions by 80%, in the end, they are not that high. There are opportunities, but I'm really not convinced that it will work. The main bottleneck is aviation. Look at accommodation, we come back to it, but it can be zero emissions. There are buildings that are zero emissions, but accommodations are not the front runners for that. So most of it is a bit too little and too late. We have only 15 years, and then we really must be on this downward track for the emissions. So yes, well, taking real responsibilities probably more than you do already. And by the way, some people think that I'm against the industry, but personally I was educated as an aircraft engineer. I love flying. I do not allow much flying for myself, but that's for other reasons. So I'm not against, and I love to go on holiday as well. So
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. You've gone a little bit over time, so I'm going to allow Matt to have a little bit of extra time to interview and question his witnesses, but I'm going to hand straight over to you, Matt, to go ahead.
That's great, thanks Harold. And what I'm going to do first actually is move directly to Jonathan Council, who's Environment Director of British Airways, and I'm going to ask him to set out some of what the industry is doing, but partly to respond to some of the points that we've heard there. I'm going to, in the cross-examination, in the question and answer with Jonathan, try and address some of those issues. But Jonathan, let me just first ask you to begin by outlining what the industry, the aviation industry in particular, is doing globally, also in the UK, to tackle emissions.
Thank you, Matt, and good afternoon, everybody. My slides should be appearing very shortly. But anyway, let me first say that, no, we recognise in the airline industry that we are a carbon-intensive industry, and therefore we are part of this carbon challenge, and we are absolutely committed to being part of the solution. We have set some targets we'll go through shortly, but we are fully committed to playing our full part in the global reduction of CO2. Recognise that we can't do that as separately as single airlines. It's an industry challenge, which is why we work very closely with our industry association, IATA. We've been doing that for the last 5 years. And let me just outline what our policy is. We are a global industry, therefore we need to be regulated globally. We want to be part of a post-Kyoto framework, a global sectoral approach, and as part of that we've set some, what we believe, very ambitious carbon reduction targets. Harold, if I can next slide, please. And these are they. So, Paul was absolutely right in terms of the 1.5%. So this is our near-term target, if you like. So a continued improvement in aircraft efficiency of 1.5% to 2020. Now the manufacturers, so that is more than possible. There's still a lot of opportunity to continue those efficiency gains, actually right out to 2050. And I'll show you a chart that outlines that in a second. But I think more importantly, it's about what are we doing to reduce our absolute level of emissions. And that's where the two next targets, oops, if you go back one. Yep. So carbon neutral growth 2020. So what does that mean? So that means aviation's emissions peaking in 2020 and thereafter starting towards a downward trajectory towards a target that Matt mentioned, which is a 50% reduction in net emissions by 2050. Where did that come from? We had a look round at all the papers that are saying, what do we need to do to avoid the worst effects of climate change? The Stern Review of 2006 said to avoid greater than 2-degree temperature rise, the global economy needs to reduce its emissions by 50%. So our view is, why should the airline industry play any less part than a 50% reduction? So that's why we set that target. The industry agreed to it, and I have to say it was probably one of the most robust debates the airline industry has had in its entire history, because you imagine there's fairly significant implications of it. But no, every major airline in the world, and in fact manufacturers, air traffic control authorities and airports are signed up to delivering this target, as indicated there. So it truly is an industry commitment to playing its full part in the global reduction of CO2.
Is this working? Yeah, great. So, Jonathan, that's a really helpful overview. One of the challenges I think Paul was throwing down for us was our long-term aspirations in terms of emissions reductions and what's possible within the sector. That's something that certainly within the UK aviation industry we've done a lot of work on. Could you just talk a bit more about our own carbon roadmap and what that sets out into the future? I think that's an important contribution.
Absolutely, and Matt mentioned sustainable aviation. So, sorry, next chart, please. So this is the group. So almost 40 partners. So we've worked extensively over the last 5 years to produce a carbon roadmap. And the latest update of that is this chart, which yes, please, came out in March. Now this is probably the most robust analysis of a forward projection of CO2 for the airline industry that has been produced. If you go to the website link at the bottom, you can see there's a 80-page report that goes into an enormous amount of detail in terms of each of these components. But this essentially breaks down how we deliver this 50% reduction by 2050. You can see at the top, the red line, that is what would happen if we just continue to grow with existing technology. The green chunk is operational efficiencies, so that's about 10%. A huge chunk from the next generation of aircraft and aircraft engines, so delivering 40 to 50% reduction in the next 30 to 40 years. And this has all been driven by the manufacturers. So Airbus, Boeing, Rolls-Royce, GE have produced those numbers. So they are committing to delivering those savings. Mentioned biofuels, and I'm glad that Paul mentioned there's been enormous momentum in biofuels in the last 3 to 4 years in the aviation industry. Our first roadmap in 2008 said that they would deliver a 9% reduction in our CO2 in 2050. Today, that's 18%, and that's just a recognition of the progress that's been made, and I can go into a lot more detail about specific projects on that. It's not the silver bullet. A lot of people say, oh, the aviation industry is saying biofuels are the silver bullet. It's not. It's a part of the mix. As I say, it's about 18%. So the sharp-eyed amongst you will say, well, that gets us back to 2005 levels by 2050. We will rely on emissions trading, market-based measures to get to that 50%. And it's not true that we oppose the EU emissions trading scheme. Most airlines in Europe are supporters, as are British Airways, of the EU emissions trading scheme. But we see it as a first step towards a global scheme. So fundamentally what the industry does support is a global scheme. And again, I can talk in some detail about progress that has been made towards delivering that global scheme. So there, and I think this is a very credible analysis. And anybody that's interested, I do, please get a closer look at this detailed report. There's a lot of man-years effort gone into preparing this forecast.
Jonathan, that's really helpful. Actually, we have got about another 6 minutes in this section to compensate for the earlier overrun. So I'm going to spend a bit of time going into detail on some of those topics because I think it's important to set out our position. Let me just begin by asking you about the international picture. So that's a UK industry picture. One of the criticisms that you might hear is, well, the UK aviation industry is reaching a relative level of market maturity. Actually, the fast growth is happening in other parts of the world. How do you see the picture globally, and particularly what do you see as the role for global market-based measures in tackling that?
Yeah. So that yellow chunk there, that will essentially be driven by a global market-based measure. And I have to say, in the last 2 years, there's been more, and this will be developed by a group called ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, so it's the intergovernmental regulatory body for aviation. There's been more progress in the last 2 years than in the last 20. So there are 2 expert groups that have been working virtually full-time, developing global solutions to enable the industry to meet this target. And in fact, this Friday, there is a major milestone. They have a ICAO council meeting. They have 3 options that they're currently looking at. And essentially, these are schemes that will enable us to deliver to our midterm target, the carbon neutral growth 2020. And ICAO have committed to finalising that proposal by their General Assembly in October 2013. So actually, we're really encouraged and truly believe that we can get to a global scheme to enable us to meet that midterm target.
That's great. So just summing up on the global piece, would it be fair to say then that you're confident from an airline perspective in being able to deliver that long-term 50% target, 50% reduction in net emissions through the combination you've outlined of operational efficiencies, new technology, biofuels and market-based measures.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And of course the key with the global scheme is it's global carbon pricing that's going to help us drive this. And if we can get global carbon pricing, which is essentially what we're aiming for, that will provide the incentive to accelerate all those technologies that we talked about. So that's why it's not either or. They go hand in hand as economic incentives and instruments. Yeah.
One of the challenges we heard from Paul was around biofuels. Are biofuels sustainable? You said they're not the silver bullet. What's the industry doing to ensure that its development of biofuels is sustainable?
Yeah, and I agree with Paul. I mean, there has been some very poor experiences, I think, with first-generation biofuels. The airline industry has established a group called SAFUG. If you can think of a better name, please let us know. But Sustainable Aviation Fuels User Group. And to be part of that, you have signed a pledge you will only use sustainable biofuels. We work very closely with the roundtable on sustainable biofuels. So the industry is committed to only using fuels that are sustainable. There's been a lot of activities. I talked about over 1,200 test flights in the last 3 years. So we're now technically comfortable this can happen. A lot of work gone into, as I say, on the sustainability front. Really now it's about how can we scale this up commercially. There are over 50 projects globally in the aviation industry looking at accelerating the production of biofuels. And please forgive me, I just want to talk a little bit about the British Airways flagship project, which is actually to build a biomass to jet plant just about 15 miles down the river here. 50,000 tonnes of biojet from waste. So totally sustainable, 95% life cycle savings. So it will be produced from waste from here in London, and it will serve all of our fuel needs here at City Airport, just across the road here. We see this as a proof of concept. You know, once we get this project up and running, which we're hoping for by 2015, we can build multiple numbers of these. And there's also there's about 15 other airlines in the world that have also signed up to similar type projects. And this is, for us, right now, the most sustainable route into biofuels for aviation.
That's great. And then finally, in the last kind of minute and a half or so we've got, could I just ask you to give your thoughts on aviation in 2050 and the kind of percentage contribution it might then be making to climate change? Paul put up some quite dramatic slides showing the percentage contribution that aviation might be making at that stage. What's your view?
I mean, today, airline industry is 2%, and it doesn't sound a lot, but it is a lot of CO2. It's about 650 million tonnes. If we deliver to our 50% target, which I think we've demonstrated that we're certainly committed to, and we've got plans to do it, that will maintain us at 2% of global emissions. So basically, we'll halve our total emissions down to about 325 million tonnes. Global emissions have to get down to 20 billion tonnes, as per the Stern report. So if you do the maths, we stay at about 2%. So that's definitely our objective. Now, I do take Paul's point around non-CO2 effects. So there are additional effects over and above CO2. Our view is we need to understand what those are. There's a lot of evidence. It's not the error bars on those are very wide, so the confidence on those effects is very low. So our view is let's let the science prove that effect. And British Airways, we do a lot of work and support into that scientific research. So for instance, we have monitors on some of our aircraft to really understand what this radiative forcing impact is at high altitudes. And of course, if there is an additional effect, then we need to take account of that, and we need to make sure that's included in our climate change reduction targets.
Thank you. With 8 seconds to spare, that's us.
Thanks very much indeed for being so prompt. Paul, you've got 5 minutes to cross-examine Jonathan, I guess.
Yeah, well, also Matt.
And Matt, of course.
Yeah,
yes.
and also maybe even I have another question for James.
Yes, you can ask anyone.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, actually, you said already some things that I wanted to ask.
Okay.
But do you agree that the technological improvements, they will peter out somewhere?
Well, if we look at this roadmap, I think
I don't see it.
It's not. So you said 1.5%. I think in the detail in this chart, I think it's 1.5% to 2020. Then it goes to 1.3%, and then it goes to 1.2%. Yeah. So it doesn't maintain at the 1.5% level, but it doesn't go to zero. So there's still, and I know the engine manufacturers So there's a couple of things they talk about.
Okay.
Thermodynamics, there's a lot of opportunity within improved thermodynamics,
Yeah,
but I
well,
think the big opportunity from the manufacturers is materials. Just the science of materials, using lighter materials. So, you know, we've got the 787 carbon fiber aircraft. Their view is there's quite a long way to go in terms of taking weight out of aircraft. So that's, I think that's still a rich area to.
On the other hand,
to
we are
mine.
already flying with 1 kilogram of material for 1 kilogram of cargo, so it's already an achievement.
Yeah.
If you look at, you are sitting in a solid thing.
Yeah.
But in actually you aren't.
Well, I think that's
But
where
don't tell the
carbon
public
fiber comes in, because it's, you know, its strength to weight ratio versus alloys is, you know, 2 to 3 times, and that was today. I think the thing that we miss here is, and the manufacturers point out, is the computational power. So what enables you to get more efficient equipment is computational power. And of course, that is on an exponential. As I said, so you know, look at where we've come in the last 50 years. Where we don't know how far it can go in the next 50 years. If you look at that, so that's based on what we know today. So their view is it could be conservative. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Paul, if I could just add to that, I mean, Jonathan stressed this, but I would just reiterate it. This is, we haven't just drawn some lines on a graph here. There's a really detailed study that we've produced. It's around 70, 80 pages, lots of supporting information which is out there transparently for people to scrutinise and to challenge and to debate. So we certainly welcome the challenge, but we took what we think is we were confident in our projections. We've done some very detailed analysis behind them. So it's not just something we pulled out of the air here.
Of course, but it still is looking into the future, and I've done that quite a lot, scenario studies. I see also other scenario studies from IATA, from ICAO. They take other solutions. So that's,
to be fair, if I could just say, the IATA chart you've got there, that is diagrammatic. That is a schematic. So that's not an analysed solution.
It's not the same level of study.
So that's just indicative. Whereas this is a much more, as Matt says, a very detailed assessment.
But it looks to me more realistic as that one.
Right.
Yeah. So we agree on that.
Yeah.
But I have a few questions that I would like just a yes or no on. The first one is the non-carbon impacts. You mentioned them already. That does mean, to my opinion, that you have to redo your target because you cannot get your target if they exist.
Well, I think absolutely.
Yes or no?
Absolutely, we will have to review our. So basically, let me go back. The fundamental principle is the airline industry will only grow if you can do it sustainably. So if there are other environmental impacts, yes, we absolutely have to address them. But the principle is they have to be robustly scientifically proven.
Sure, no doubt about it. But if they exist,
absolutely,
then the goal must be.
We have to address this.
Will there be a reduction of demand after 2050, or do you believe that demand for aviation for kilometers? Just yes or no.
Well, no. By all things being equal, let me say. It's not even the right question though. The question is the industry. Every industry, a carbon-intensive industry, has to internalise its environmental costs. Yeah. We have to do that, everybody else does. Therefore, all things being equal, with carbon pricing, air travel will become more expensive. Clearly.
So it depends on that. Then.
Yeah, so it depends on what the carbon price becomes, and therefore, but all things being equal, aviation will become more expensive because we're going to have to cost in our environmental impacts.
Okay. Yeah. In case that we do not meet those goals somehow, some of your options do not turn out as you think. That could happen. I mean, it's just future, we don't know. In case that, is it then likely that somebody can expect from you to reduce demand?
The variable here, the variable here is the carbon trading piece,
I know.
So what we don't deliver on the technology, we'll use carbon trading. The variable with carbon trading is not the cap, because the carbon trading is basically all designed to deliver a cap in emissions.
Sure.
The variable is the price of carbon.
Yes, I know.
So if things get more, so for me, if things get more difficult, the price of carbon will be higher. Therefore, the price of air travel will be higher. Therefore, demand will come down. Okay. So that's the way to frame and think about this.
That might have quite a significant impact on
demand. There is a scenario in the world where if the world, and it's not just an aviation scenario, it's a global scenario where we struggle as a civilization to reduce our CO2. That will reflect itself in a much higher carbon price, and that will make all carbon-intensive industries, those products and services, more expensive. Yeah.
And you still abide those?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We fundamentally support carbon pricing.
I wanted to make that somebody has to help you to control the whole thing.
Yeah. We support carbon pricing, and we have to pay for our carbon emissions.
Well, that's an important conclusion, I think.
Paul, can I ask you now to question your witness?
Oh, yes. I will. And I will first have some questions to Scott. And that's about the role of the tourists themselves. We didn't discuss it so far, but as we have seen, demand is still an important parameter in the whole issue. You did publish several papers about attitudes and psychology of travelers. Could you tell us something about the attitudes of tourists against climate change itself, against the problem?
Of course, and thanks for having me here today. I suppose a lot of this depends on how much faith you have in technology to solve the problem, or whether you want to look at carbon trading. But the question of demand and whether actual consumers are concerned enough to change their behavioral practices is perhaps another pathway, and that's what I want to comment on. My collaborative work has been based mainly in the UK and Europe, and so far I can say that those who actually profess as consumers to care about the climate impacts of air travel are ironically those who seem to travel the most. So we have found that there's definitely evidence of attitudinal concern towards air travel's climate impacts from this group, but this is actually normally directed at short-haul travel, where viable substitutes such as rail or coach exist.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so actually you find that those tourists will not really change their habits just because they know there is an issue, an environmental problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, what we're finding is a particular attitude amongst some groups in society, and what we're not finding is actual behavioral changes. So although we have some well-resourced tourists who profess to be concerned, few are actually willing to change their behaviors. Additionally, Janet's work has shown that less privileged groups, while aware of climate change issues, often fail to connect air travel to climate change in a meaningful way. So what we're dealing with is an attitude-behavior gap in which the personal benefits of tourism, accessed through air travel, often seem too important for consumers in relation to the abstract consequences of climate change. So what we have is really little evidence of voluntary behavioral change, unfortunately.
Yeah, so we may probably conclude that we cannot expect from the public that it just changes its behavior in holiday making or traveling because of the environment. Then you need something more, like other prices, other supply, that kind of things. Then I like to go to Janet. Oh,
sorry.
Oh, that was you. No problem. So let's now look at what a low carbon tourism sector might look like. And you have published several papers applying life cycle assessments. So my first question is, could you tell us something about it?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me here. I also, a bit like Paul, I felt slightly uncomfortable with the idea that somehow we were against the tourism industry at the start, because that's not really how I feel. And I suppose from my perspective and the work that we've done on life cycle assessment, if we're looking at tourism as a whole, if you were going out to do an audit of any industry, you know, with your audit you would basically set out to understand where your biggest problems lie. And as Paul's slides show at the start, you know, one of the most significant problems lies with aviation and with the travel side of tourism. I think it's important to recognise as well that some of that problem tends to lie with the long-haul travel, which is a minor share of all the trips. And if we were doing an audit of an industry, you tend to start with that problem area first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, given that tourism, of course, by definition, has to do with transportation, is it possible to envisage a low carbon tourism industry?
Yeah, I feel definitely so, and I think we might be quite a long way away from it at the moment, but there's certainly a lot that the industry can do. If you look at the tourism sector as a whole, it's actually an industry which has an almost infinite opportunities to substitute products. So, for instance, if you take at the individual tourist level, Tourists can substitute their product for an alternative product that might be much nearer home. They can substitute their product for something which is less dependent on air travel and more dependent on rail or other forms of transport. And that would significantly change the impact of that particular holiday. And in the same way, many destinations as well can also substitute their markets. So from a destination's point of view, there's an awful lot they can do by substituting where they're attracting visitors from. And you know, these are obvious ways that the industry could begin to actually repackage their products so that it's much less carbon intensive.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, from my own research, I found that actually the main engine for the growth of tourism, the number of trips, which is the actual growth we are generally seeking, globally is just depending on GDP per capita. It's pretty dull, just straight line up. Sorry, but that's what we find. Of course, accessibility has an impact on the distribution of those trips, a main impact even. So it's still important, but it's not important in itself for the growth, how transportation is organized, as long as there is transportation. But what then, and that's a question again to Janet, is the role of more fast transport like air transport, or in the future even maybe space travel, like flying for a beer to Australia in 2 hours and back the same day? Who would like to do that, by the way? Nobody. And if it's there and we want to stop it, then who would be against stopping it? Everybody probably. So, but that's a sideline. Sorry.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one for me, because obviously there's only so many tourists, you know, and that's not always going to be growing necessarily. And really what fast travel tends to do is alter the destinations that people can access, and also, you know, obviously the distance that people can travel within the time frames that they have available. But really this is just about moving, you know, tourists further to different places. And really we're not going to change overall the income that's available from tourism. We just might grow the emissions. And I think one of the things we have to recognise is that most tourism is actually based on land transport, overland transport, something like 82%. There's only about 18% that's dependent on air travel. And I actually think as a sector, but maybe it's a society, we have a bit of an obsession with speed. And in fact, there's research in the UK which has begun to question the need to increase the speed of travel, because actually lots of studies begin to show that people do lots of useful things with their travel time, useful and productive things. And actually maybe we ought to be rethinking the quality of our travel time. It's really about the quality of this time and what we can do with it. You know, for me, that's something the industry needs to be thinking a bit more creatively about.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Any more to say about this?
I think I'm done there. Do you want me to move on to ask you?
Yeah, but I'm looking at the clock.
Oh, okay.
So maybe we should skip that little
Oh,
bit.
right, I see.
We've got another 2 minutes.
We have 2 minutes still?
2 minutes.
Okay, well, we can try.
Yeah, okay. Very quickly then, I just wanted to put a question to Paul, because he will be better able to answer it than me. Within this kind of context, there's often an argument that we need to maintain aviation because of poverty in other parts of the world, and the UNWTO even has their STEP program, Sustainable Tourism Eliminating Poverty. And I suppose my question to Paul is, you know, whether aviation is important to maintain poverty alleviation.
Yes, well, I do agree that several economies in the world, small isles, at remote places, they certainly have a problem if aviation would have a problem with their economies. That's clear. But more in general, I'm not so sure if the argument always hits the point, because, and then I go directly to to another issue. We did a study about all the travel in the world, including domestic travel. We had a database for that, and then we simply assumed to reduce the maximum distance people could travel. How we do that is not important at this moment. To, for example, 10,000 kilometer or 6,000 kilometer, which will hit, or 1,500, which almost means no flying at all, just for the sake of seeing what happens in the distribution of the trips. As we know that the number of trips is a function of the GDP per capita, we didn't change that. So that's the same. 5 billion, including domestic. So there is a redistribution. Those far long trips, they will go somewhere else, redistributed along the lines of what the other people that go not so far away from the same countries go to. And then we tested if there was a specific problem for the least developed countries, and it turned out it was not. There were some countries severely damaged by it, like losing 80% of their trips and their tourists. But there were also countries, least developed countries like Mozambique, that gained from it because the people near them, living near them, and there are millions of them, they started not to go far away, so they started to go to countries like their neighbor country. So you have a mixed impact. So that means also that if we continue to increase the distance, that we also damage some least developed countries. You can reverse the argument as well. And I know this is quite a lot of mathematics and maybe new for some people. But that's what we found under the assumptions I told you. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. So, 5 minutes, Matt.
Great. Thank you. Lots to pick up on there. And I think there'll be questions to Paul, Scott and Janet as well. If I could just start by picking up on a theme that I think ran through all of your presentations in different ways. You clearly foresee a world where actually growth particularly in air travel, which was a theme that came through, is difficult to reconcile with climate change. And you talked about the need for demand management, substituting long-haul travel with different products, travel closer to home. Is the world that you see as a sustainable one where our ability to travel internationally is fundamentally restricted from what it is today?
Yeah, to some extent it is, but as I told you, we have this choice of the optimized, the economically optimized futures. And the one was just flying as we do now. And of course there will be more Chinese flying, so it might mean for the Western people we fly a little bit less. But it certainly doesn't mean we do not travel anymore. As Janet explained already, we can travel in different ways, and we can get a lot of pleasure from it. Even we did a study in the relation between the distance people travel and their happiness. And actually there was a significant relation, and it was slightly going up for those who traveled further away. But there are all sorts of other impact. It might be much richer people, which also has an impact. So we try to correct for that. But so there is some relation, but I do not think that the whole travel world will collapse because we fly only 2 times in a lifetime to Australia from the United Kingdom instead of every year.
And how do you tally that with people's, I guess, freedom of choice to be able to travel?
Yeah,
and a follow-on question, actually, just to throw it at the same time. How, if that is your world, what policies would you use to achieve that? How that would be politically deliverable to actually restrict travel in that way?
Well, actually, the scenario which was presented by Jonathan, if you have this emission trading and the prices go high because there is a tendency to still travel, so then it goes up because there is a lack of carbon dioxide to buy, and it could end up in $1,000 per ton even. Most economics don't dare to think about it, but it can happen. So then, yeah, the price will be something. It will be not available, affordable for some people. But we are restricted now as well. I mean, I cannot go for my beer to Australia and be the same day back. So that's also a restriction. It's at another level. But it's not at a level that we say, stop traveling. It's not the case. Just the 5 billion can go on and the 7 billion in the future as well. That's not the problem. So it's a world with a lot of trips still.
I was just going to say, could I add there? You have to bear in mind that the vast majority of the world don't have the freedom to travel anyway, because they just simply don't have the wealth to do so. And in fact, there's a huge amount that the tourism industry can do without really actually having to restrict people's travel, but just by changing maybe where they travel to or how they travel to those destinations. And there's a lot of options to do that.
Restricting where they travel to sounds like a restriction to me, unless I'm missing something.
You might be substituting an alternative option, because in many cases, that alternative option would be just as lovely. But certainly there's options, within, if we just take Europe, there's plenty of options actually to just switch people to alternative modes of transport, which would have a much lower carbon footprint.
In closing, sorry, how long have I got? About another minute. So I think it was interesting that, Paul, in your questions to us, you focused on the role of carbon pricing. And I think that is an area that we're agreeing. There is a role for carbon pricing. I think our analysis, certainly my own company's analysis, would be, yes, the carbon price will rise. There's a lot aviation can do within its sector, but there's a lot that it will, a number of areas where it's going to need to buy reductions from other sectors as well. But actually, because people value hugely the ability to travel internationally, people are prepared to pay a higher price, in some cases a significantly higher price for international travel. So I'd almost turn your final question to Jonathan round to you and say, would you accept that there is a scenario where actually aviation becomes, if you like, a premium user of some of our remaining ability to emit carbon by the time we get to 2050, and with premium goes the fact that people are paying more for it, but you can actually see a continued and potentially even a growing aviation industry at that stage?
Yeah, I really believe that if you come to that stage that aviation is taking most of the carbon permits, then other sectors, even like just food production, will have such a huge problem. They will not be able to deliver this. I mean, in the end, we do not need to reduce by 50%, but by 80%. And if you let aviation grow as it is doing at the moment and has done the past decades, then we end up with 3-4 times current volumes by 2100. I mean, I'm talking long waves. After that, it will probably flatten out because of several reasons. So there will be all sorts of social and distributional problems. Those who can pay for the ticket, they buy the carbon, and those who cannot pay for their food can even not pay for the food because of the carbon that's taken by the... You see the problem that might arise at that moment. It's a long future, it's not tomorrow. I mean, buy now those credits, that's good for everything. But in the end, there is a limit also to that, I'm sure.
Is it worth repeating the numbers?
Sorry?
Is it worth just...
I just wanted the numbers.
No, I wouldn't be so rude. Go.
Just to be absolutely clear around the numbers. So today, aviation emits about 700 million tonnes. If we do nothing, tops, that will go to 2.5 billion tonnes. Now, we've said the global economy needs to get down to 20 billion tonnes. So in the worst case scenario, aviation is between 10 and 15% of global CO2. So these nightmare scenarios where it's going to take up 100% of carbon, that's just not true. And that's the worst case scenario.
Dispute my graph I showed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you've done, I'm not sure where the numbers come from, but I think you must have put it in. What we normally hear is there's a multiplier of 5 or 6 because of non-CO2, which is way from being proven.
I didn't do that.
Pure CO2 is
but
between 10 and 15%.
It's not only aviation, of course, it's the whole tourism sector.
Right, so I'm talking aviation.
Doubles it at least.
A great introduction to move to the next section. We're going to move on to accommodation. I think, Paul, you're going to start off by asking your expert witnesses this time.
Yeah.
You have 5 minutes.
Okay, I will invite Scott to... Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, you shouldn't touch them. They are dangerous.
Actually, I'm going to ask Paul a couple of questions about the hospitality industry in the context of things here, and to what extent the hospitality industry is actually taking responsibility with respect to its climate change, in respect to carbon emissions. So, Paul, in terms of hospitality, how important is a reduction of accommodation footprints in the scheme of things here?
Well, first of all, accommodation is responsible for about a quarter of the total emissions of current tourism, carbon emissions, excluding the non-carbon impact. So that's very relevant, and we also found that actually accommodations, the increase of emissions from accommodations, because, for example, a shift towards more luxurious accommodations, that's already, you can see that already happen, causes it that this will not go down, so it grows as fast almost as aviation's emissions. So there is certainly scope to do something there as well.
Well, what can we say about schemes that are out there to make accommodation more sustainable? What is your take on those?
Yeah, well, there are many, maybe there are too many initiatives. You have 150 eco-labels that I know of, but I'm sure there are 100 more that I missed. And that's not really, well, it's helpful that those companies involved, that they are looking at them and are involved in thinking about environment, but for the customer it's a mess. It's very difficult to value them, and really I don't care at the moment. I just take the hotel that's at the place where I want to be. So yeah.
So taking one of them as an example, you and I are both well familiar with Travel Life. What share of hotels at the moment are accredited by Travel Life?
Yeah, it's difficult to answer. On the Destinet, the European website, they mention 500, but that's too low, far too low. I believe it will be several thousand. I found another information that said that there are 15,000 registered, but not audited, and that would be 1,500. So, well, maybe it's 2,000. It's even lower. Okay. Anyway, we have 1 million accommodations in the world, so we have some opportunities here. Let's say positive.
What about what would you say is the impact of Travel Life accreditation on the carbon footprint of accommodation? Taking them as an example.
Yeah, that's a bit difficult to say because the current requirements are not really quantitative in that respect. You have to save to use, for example, energy-saving bulbs, but how many is not required. This is not a requirement. So we really don't know. Probably it will be better on average because those who go as a first company to go to such schemes, of course, they do more than others. But we simply don't know.
All right, so we've taken Travel Life as an example, but what about the other close to 150 eco-labels?
Yeah, that's even less clear. Sometimes you cannot find the criteria or whatever. So that's some are very good, but only a few.
All right. Well, trying to keep the time here,
yeah.
What would you say overall in terms of the hospitality sector? Would you say they're in the front lines of sustainable development? What's your opinion there?
No, I don't think so. There are very few examples where single hotels are really doing a good job, like almost zero emissions. And the funny thing is that in building zero emissions, there are even glass houses in the Netherlands that produce energy, glass houses. You see in the winter, not in the summer, no problem, but in the winter. Overall, they make energy for you. And I do not see that kind of huge schemes for the accommodation sector. Well, the technology is there, and I think you can do much more here than is done now. Though still there are a lot of initiatives, but the effectiveness of that is not that much.
Okay, thanks, Paul. So basically the argument we're putting forward, just to summarize, is that we do argue that accommodations add significantly to the sector's carbon footprint. The technologies are out there in terms of buildings, but we would argue that the hospitality sector is definitely not in the front line of implementing those changes.
Great, thank you. Some clear messages there. Stephen Brandt, you're Director of the International Tourism Partnership. You work a lot with the hotel industry. Not in the front line of sustainability, too many eco-labels. Could you just talk us through some of the practical examples of steps that hotels around the world are taking to cut emissions?
Certainly. Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Matt. Just to go back to the first point, Paul, you were saying that accommodation accounts for a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. The data that I've seen is less than that it's 20% of the 5% of total travel and tourism emissions. So the data that I have and that I've seen from WTO and UNEP is 20% of the total travel and tourism. So we're talking about 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions from the accommodation sector in total. Clearly, hotels within that are a part of that 1% global or 20% of the sector. Is the fundamental question, is the sector taking responsibility for its greenhouse gas emissions? I would say absolutely yes. Is the industry doing enough? I don't think anyone here would say yes, they're doing enough. As you said, there's no room for complacency. But I think we've seen a huge change in the last few years of the way that the industry is moving forwards ahead of regulation and, interestingly, in tune with what the customer is looking for. And I'll give you a few examples. So just looking back over the last couple of years, I can quote any number of the major hotel companies who have achieved concrete emissions reductions on a global scale. So Wyndham Worldwide reduced their total CO2 footprint by 5% since 2010, between 2010 and 2011. That's 5% in 1 year across their owned and managed and leased estate. Hilton Worldwide have invested massively in the Lightstay program, and they've set ambitious targets of reducing their CO2 and energy footprint by 20% between 2008 and 2014, as one example. Already by 2011, they're 10.9% better than they were in 2008 in terms of their global carbon dioxide footprint. So there are some good examples at individual brand level, but I think the point I wanted to talk about in particular is the way more than that, the industry is now beginning to collaborate in a way that it hasn't done before around these issues. And we've been leading as the International Tourism Partnership, but also jointly with the World Travel and Tourism Council, a groundbreaking new program to put in place for the first time a comparable and credible way of measuring and communicating carbon footprint for the individual customer. So this is a process that's been going on for 18 months or more now. We launched phase 2 in the summer. It's had the full backing of 23 global companies. And what this does is it means that in making your choice, we've spoken a lot about the customer already today. If we don't get the customer involved in this debate, we're not going to make progress, is my basic argument here. But what this does is it allows the customer to say, if in booking an overnight stay or in booking a meeting or a conference or an event, that customer can now start to get comparable data that allows them then to use their commercial decision-making processes to drive continual improvement in the industry. So the Hotel Carbon Measurement Initiative is up and running. It's getting great feedback from customers and from stakeholders, and it will drive continual improvement in the sector.
Just on that point of customers, I mean, do you see, what's the evidence to date that customers are interested, corporate customers, individual customers, actually voting with their feet, choosing hotels that are greener, more carbon efficient? Sure. Well, I'm going to break the protocol and agree with something that was said by Scott and Paul earlier in terms of the plethora of green certification schemes which are consumer-facing. And I think there are probably too many of them out there. I don't personally understand many of them. I think most people do not. The industry themselves do not understand many of them. So I think in the B2C market, in the consumer market, we're not yet seeing a sufficient degree of customer maturity or interest in making purchase decisions based around environmental considerations. But in the B2B marketplace, in the corporate marketplace, we absolutely are seeing that. And the whole start point for the Hotel Carbon Measurement Initiative, this collaborative project that I've been talking about, is so that the corporate customer, who at the moment historically has been frustrated by inconsistent data, can for the first time get consistent data. So the whole project was driven by an emergent customer trend, and the hotel industry has stepped up to the plate and has come together and is now responding with comparable data to meet that customer demand. So in terms of public sector procurement, it is beginning to drive purchase decisions, absolutely. In terms of some of the major corporates as well, it is beginning to drive purchase decisions. And one very quick final one. We heard quite a strong challenge there, the hotel sector not in the front line of sustainability. Are you in the front line? Are you taking responsibility for emissions? Yes, absolutely taking responsibility, and the hotel industry has been working in a very collaborative way on these issues for over 20 years now, from the days when frankly no one really spoke about sustainability and it was in the kind of the geek camp perhaps, to where it's now mainstreamed and every major company around the world has got a CSR statement and environmental auditing and so on. So, for many, many years and decades before this became mainstream, the hotel industry has been actively working on this, where I think perhaps it hasn't been as visible as it could have been, and that's perhaps reflected in some of the questions and the awareness of what the hotel industry is doing. But the collaborative interaction that I see on a daily basis between all of the leading brands behind the scenes, not with a view to trying to promote themselves as green companies, but in terms of trying to improve processes, improve operational performance, and get the collaboration in place to address sustainability. I think it's been there for decades. Great, thank you.
Thanks very much. We're going to shift now to the final area of discussion, which is about cruise and ground transportation. And Paul, you're going to begin by asking your expert witnesses a few questions, and then we'll have Matt. Then we are going to come to the floor for some questions from the audience. So if you could beginning to prepare those questions, we'll have 10 or 15 minutes and I'm really keen to get you involved in the discussion. But let's go first of all to Paul to ask your expert witnesses about cruise and ground transportation.
Okay, thank you. I have some questions for Janet. Janet, do you believe that cruises, the most common large ship ones, the big ones, that they are any good for reducing carbon footprints? People.
Well, the straightforward answer is no. And I think, sadly, I think a lot of the public believe they do. And I think what people fail to understand is that a cruise ship is actually moving a massive amount of infrastructure around with it. And therefore it's very high in terms of fuel consumption, etc. And so that's a problem area. And also some of the cruises that go to very remote destinations like Antarctica, these are particularly problematic, and they're often associated with long-haul flights as well. And clearly in Antarctica there's no economic impact. There's other environmental problems too.
Okay, thank you. But are there any cruises that may add to solutions?
Of the large ocean-going type, probably not. There might be some more niche sort of tall ships fueled by wind power, where there might be some solution. There may be some river cruises in places like China, in Europe, where they may be using smaller ships and they're staying overland, staying in overnight accommodation on land, so they're not transporting all that infrastructure with them. There's some opportunities there, perhaps.
Okay. Well, let's turn to the ground transportation issue. A major way to reduce the carbon footprint is by changing transport modes. Mm-hmm. So, do you feel that this kind of slow travel, as it sometimes is coined, that could become some major trend instead of a niche?
Yeah, I think there's some real opportunities there. I think we have to be careful about the definition of slow travel, which is a very difficult term because it's emerged from various community groups and operators, and it has many different meanings. And the meaning that I think we're interested in here is where travel to the destination is by overland forms, which are low carbon forms of travel like train, coach, etc. In our research there are two obvious sort of opportunities. One is for destinations which reposition themselves as slow travel destinations where they are geographically well placed to tap into nearby markets. But also more widely across the industry there is an opportunity for some of these slow travel principles to be applied much more widely, but this would require quite a wholesale rethink of the way the tourism industry is delivered at the moment.
Okay, and before I just asked you how to promote, how can the sector promote this kind of travel? Another question, did you ever book an international rail ticket, and can you compare the ease of doing so, is booking an international aviation or air ticket?
I'm smiling because I don't think I've actually booked an international air ticket for over 20 years. I regularly book rail tickets, and I've done a lot of research with people who are involved in both kinds, and essentially people find booking international rail travel very complex. There are lots of problems with it, not least that you can often not book more than 3 months in advance, and if you want to cross more than one international boundary, say in somewhere like Europe, it's also additionally complex.
Okay, and then more generally, what could the sector do about this?
Well, I think there's a lot that can be done by reconsidering the markets and also their needs. I think this assumption for the more distant, the exotic, needs to be challenged. I think families can have a very successful holiday without actually having to travel very far, and I think we need to exploit that. There's better opportunities to restructure products. There's opportunities to actually embed activities within the actual travel to the destination so that it's not just this rush to go from A to B. There's obviously lots of scope for much more package options that have rail travel embedded as part of them instead of the air travel that's most typical.
Okay, thank you. So, well, concluding, I think we can say that the industry is more or less ignoring this kind of slow travel. If you go, for example, to a travel agency and you ask for an air ticket from Amsterdam to Paris, they just issue it. If you ask for a rail ticket, they are asking, you don't want an air ticket? Well, it's much easier to go by rail that same journey, so it's even not doing something good for your customers. But that's an anecdote, of course. Sorry.
Thanks, Paul. Let's go to Matt.
Great. So in my final section, I'm going to be inviting James Whittingham, Group Environment Manager from TUI Travel, to give us his thoughts on how the industry is addressing cruise and ground transportation. Let's just take those two issues in turn. We had a fairly strong challenge on cruise, James, which seemed to be that the industry is doing nothing on cruise liners at all, as far as I could tell. What's your view?
Well, I'd obviously counter that, being on this side of the panel. I mean, cruise is at a fairly embryonic stage in its sort of cycle in terms of embracing this topic, and certainly it hasn't been given the same level of focus or detailed detraction, let's say, as aviation has. That said, there's a number of operators that are doing quite a lot already, particularly in, say, ocean-going cruising. So some of the large operators are already doing a lot of work to improve the fuel efficiency of their operations, as well as looking to procure new build ships that offer significant improvements in fuel efficiency. So, I mean, just briefly, in terms of the operation phase, it won't come as any surprise to you to hear that the fuel price for marine fuels is just as volatile as it is for aviation kerosene. And, you know, last year, typically if you were to take the average market rates for cruise fuel versus aviation fuel, to the regular cruise fuel, what we call heavy fuel oil, typically $600 a tonne, aviation fuel $1,000 a tonne, but marine gas oil, which is what cruise operators are required to use in EU ports and other sensitive areas around the world, is around $1,000 a tonne as well. So there's a financial imperative for cruise operators, much as there is for aviation, to want to focus on energy efficiency and fuel efficiency. And it's also worth noting, just sort of going back to Janet's point, that whilst 2/3 of the energy requirement to push a ship around is propulsion, there is still 1/3 of that energy requirement for the hotel services. So there's a lot that can be done and is being done to reduce the energy demand from that aspect. I mean, with regard to new builds, there are now ships that are being built in Scandinavian dockyards, for example, that are offering alternative fuels insofar as LNG, liquefied natural gas, is being sort of put forward as an option. And that in itself is around 15% less carbon intensive as a fuel compared to a more traditional heavy fuel oil. So certainly the industry is focusing on its need to address its environmental impacts. But that focus is perhaps not being quite as severe to date as it has been within the aviation sector.
Thanks, James. And just turning then to ground transportation in our last couple of minutes, can you just outline some of the steps that the industry is taking on ground transportation?
Sure. I mean, within, I work for TUI Travel, as you mentioned, large vertically integrated tour operator. We have a lot of transportation fleets that take our guests from their arrival location, airport, for example, to their hotels. And so for that reason, we are particularly concerned about ensuring that we have high load factors on those buses, as other operators would, and we want to ensure that we operate as efficiently as possible because, you know, we use a considerable amount of fuel. So where we can, we're refleeting those buses or those coaches to use the most air quality friendly and fuel efficient engines as well. So Euro 5 compliant engines now typically 8 to 10% more fuel efficient than the Euro 3 and 4 that they replace. And, you know, these buses are, you know, significantly expensive, require a high lot of investment, but at the same time are offering much more, shall I say, high technology on board, everything from telemetry to feedback to a central point in terms of analysing how these buses are being operated and being driven. But then, if we return to other forms of ground transportation, then, you know, large tour operators are now looking to offer more ground-based options to their customers. Everything from taking a ski trip to the French ski fields, you know, they're offering Eurostar services, for example. But hopefully Rail Team, which is a collaboration of rail operators in Europe, 2013 is going to see services departing from the UK to Germany for the first time, direct from London St Pancras. So I'm hoping that, as the point was made by the other side, that rail actually is going to become a simpler alternative for customers so that they can actually have those choices more readily available to them.
Great. Bang on time.
It's been extraordinary the way we've stuck to time. It's made my job very easy so far. Time for questions from the floor. Good. Can we have the microphone here first, please? Here.
I'm Samantha Mailing from World Travel Market. I wanted to find out your views on the Southeast Airport debate. We have the Commission that's going to report back in 2015. Do you prefer the Boris Island option, or a third runway at Heathrow, or expanding other airports in the Southeast? What's the best option from your point of view?
Can I ask for that question to be put in the context of the debate about carbon, and for a brief answer, because there are lots of other people who want to ask questions. Just one from each side.
Yeah, let me give a very quick answer. I mean, I have to say, at a World Travel Market, I wasn't expecting to debate hub airport capacity in the southeast of England in the context of this debate. I'll give you a Heathrow Airport view. We think that hub airports are important. We think that the government should examine all options, and we welcome the process that they've set up to do that. But I don't think that's the primary purpose of today's debate, really, to get into the ever-vexed question of southeast airport capacity.
Just a quick answer.
Well,
I can
you
give a response.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, this debate rages, and it rages from whether it's a kind of UK economic debate, and I think at the moment we're discussing a more kind of global issue, and so therefore this is...
Okay, let's go to the next question. In the corner there. This gentleman here, then we'll come here. Are there questions on this side of the room? No.
Paul Miles, journalist. Presumably a way of continuing to improve the efficiency of airlines is to squeeze more passengers in. But as you see it becoming more niche and more premium market, how are you going to rationalise those two things? And why do you continue to market the space and the luxury of space as rather than, say, marketing how many people you squeeze in an airline?
So, no, absolutely. We are heavily incentivized to squeeze as many people onto our aircraft as possible. Load factors are a critical determinant of profitability of the business. And I'm happy to say that BA's load factors are up. We're up to 80% now. Now, people compare us to charter carriers and low-cost carriers. They're fundamentally different business models. When you run a network airline over, 80% is a world-class load factor figure. So, we're pretty happy with that. Space is a different issue. That's basically responding to the market need. Yeah, and people, when they're going on long-haul travel, they want space and they're willing to pay for it. That said, I have to say it's a revolutionary business class product, the yin-yang product, so the flat bed, is the most efficient use of space in any business class cabin in the world. Yeah. So if you've ever had fortunate to travel with it, if you notice most business class cabins are 222, our business class cabin is 242. We get an extra 2 seats in across. So from an environment point of view, it's a great product. Yeah. So.
Actually, I do agree to some extent with your statement, because squeezing in as many people in an aircraft has a downside as well. The cost goes down, so many more people will start to fly. So the total volume, it's just the aircraft that's burning its fuel, and the difference is not that much.
Okay, we have another question here.
Yeah, hello. My name's Andy Jefferson. Work for Sustainable Aviation. I just wondered if perhaps the airlines, TUI and British Airways, could just let us know what their plans are around new aircraft. Obviously, it's a key part of the carbon roadmap, and I think it'd be interesting to hear the views.
And if I could just add to that question, because I think it's highly relevant to it, it would be useful, I think, to have a comment on hub or point-to-point flying.
Right. Yeah. So so British Airways. So we are looking forward to the A380 and the 787. The first of those arrive in our fleet from next year. So the A380. And these are next generation, more efficient aircraft. The A380 is 20% more fuel efficient than the 747 it replaces. The 787, as I mentioned earlier, that's a carbon fibre aircraft. So that's the first fully carbon fibre hull aircraft. So it's 40% lighter, 30% more fuel efficient than the aircraft it replaces. So that's very significant. But in terms of hub, we support the UK to be competitive needs a hub. Absolutely, it needs a world-class competitive hub, and our view is, there's one. It's got to be near London. We're not sort of declaring where that should be, because obviously that's very politically sensitive. But and I think that is efficient. That is efficient from an environmental point of view, because it is the most efficient way to connect lots of people. So one of the arguments, and I think there's been some analysis around it, by not having hub capacity here in the UK, there are 7 million journeys from the regions to other hubs in Europe to take a long-haul flight. So you could argue those people are taking 2 flights where in theory they should have taken 1, i.e. a long-haul flight from the UK. So not having hub capacity drives up carbon emissions.
Depending, I think, on how they get to the airport in the UK.
Indeed, and clearly most of them, a lot of them do. Over 50% get it through, surface access. So,
You're next.
Moises Cedeño from Bocconi University, Milan. This is for Jonathan. I would like to know a little bit about the supply chain management or customer management that you're doing with all the. You have a huge alliance worldwide with all the travel agencies, which I think they have a huge importance since they are the one who shape the expectations of the customers. And in that way, they will make the big change for me. And I personally know that there are like too many travel agencies worldwide that they don't have any concept of what sustainability is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the alliances are primarily there to drive global networks. Yeah. So where in the airline industry there's some real hurdles to the normal acquisition cycle that takes place in other industries because they're seen as strategic assets. So for instance, nobody can buy more than 25% of a US carrier, and those rules exist everywhere. So to overcome that normal consolidation that should take place, airlines have to replace that with alliances. So really they're a stopgap until you get true consolidation. That said, I mean, we recognise in the industry we do need to do more to get out our sustainability messages. Now we do a little bit of that through One World, but I think that's much better done at an industry level. That's why we work very closely with IATA, and to get the messages out there that we as an industry recognise this is a challenge and we're fully committed to accepting that challenge. And that's why we've signed up. And I believe we are the only global industry that has signed up to a global CO2 reduction target. And I think that was a major step forward in terms of demonstration of our commitment on climate change. Yeah.
Are there any more questions from the floor? Okay, I'll come to you, Xavier, first, and then to the gentleman here, and then to you. Xavier?
It's a question for James. You'd mentioned ground transport, but if you look at some of the excursions you're offering as TUI in the destinations where you go, you actually offer flying. Sharm el-Sheikh, for example, you've got 8 excursions on your product range, 4 of them in flying. Luxor, Petra, Cairo, and Jerusalem are 4 of your 8 excursions. It doesn't matter how much you reduce the carbon of the transport from your hotel to your airport when you're offering excursions that's unsustainable.
If I had a microphone, I'll answer you.
Okay, sorry. Bring you one.
Okay, thank you. Oh, cheers. I mean, you're right. Those are air-based excursions. I mean, they form a specific part of our program. But I mean, we have a very active environmental coordinator or a sustainable development coordinator within our accommodation and destinations part of our business that operate and offer the excursions and make the relationships with all the different ground handlers. So you're right to say that. I mean, but I guess it's a very small percentage of our overall excursions, and we're taking steps to really look at improving the sustainability of our excursions, as you'll hopefully see in our Sustainable Holidays Plan launched a couple of months ago. We're a large organisation, and one point I could make is that Matt could have called me up as a witness for every single one of these topics. So, as a Sustainable Development Department, we have a huge range of topics to address. So it's a good point, but we're on the partway through this journey rather than having really got there.
Okay,
Thank you.
Your question, please.
Yeah, I'm Andy Rutherford, Fresh Eyes, People to People Travel. Your enticing broad brush but detailed graph at the beginning. Biofuels. So much debate. And I'm just wondering, in your 80 pages supporting that, what are your assumptions about biofuels? Where they're sourced? Because, as you are, I'm sure, very, very aware, the substitution of food crops around the world is a massive threat, and we've just come from major meetings discussing this.
I'm glad you raised that. And there are some big concerns around crop-based fuels, which is why we, as a company, have gone down the biomass to liquid route until we have resolved this ILUC issue, the indirect land use change issue, which is basically making crop-based fuels currently unsustainable. And as I say, the industry has signed up to not using unsustainable biofuels. So our assumption in the 18% of biofuels in the CO2 roadmap is that there'll be multiple pathways. So a proportion of it will be biomass to liquid. And one of the criticism I get is, well, there won't be enough waste. There's a lot of waste. I mean, our plant just here in East London will use 500,000 tonnes. There's 200 million tonnes of waste in the UK. We could build 400 of these plants. Now, clearly, we can't get all of that waste, and so there's a lot of waste. And if you look at other parts of the world, that's also the case. But that's just part of the mix. There's also, we believe, by then we will be able to solve this ILUC issue. There will be sustainable-based, crop-based biofuels where you use land that will not compete for food and will not compete for water. We're not there yet. And that's why we're not driving down that pathway. But by 2050, everyone, and most of the NGOs are convinced, yes, by 2050 we will be able to get down there. There are others. Alcohol to jet is really interesting. So there's been a lot of progress made there, particularly in the US. And I think Paul mentioned algae. Now, it's not going to be in the next 3 to 5 years. I think this is probably a 10-year away before we can scale it. But there's a number of projects around the world looking at algae-based fuels. So again, no silver bullet in terms of the biofuel pathway. It will be a mix. But I think the 18% is fairly conservative. I mean, the EU target white paper on aviation 2 years ago is saying 40%. E4 Tech study said it could be 90%. So I think 18% is reasonably conservative. And if we can prove success of some of these pathways, I think it could be greater than that.
Paul, do you want to just say anything on this quickly? Use this mic.
I can use this one. Yes, well, I think it's take for example waste. If other sectors want to reduce their carbon footprint, one way to do that is reduce waste, of course. So it's actually delaying the carbon emission by taking their waste, which has got quite a lot of carbon dioxide has gone in and in the material, and then you burn it. So then again, in the end. So it depends very much where the waste comes from.
Yeah, no, indeed. And that's why it has to contain biomass, of course, and that's why one of the things we're doing is working very closely to make sure there's a minimum level of biomass.
Exactly.
And our view is you should only get the credit award based on its life cycle analysis. Yeah.
Yeah.
So therefore, so that there's an incentive to maximise the amount. And clearly, we're not. We fully support the drive to reduce the amount of waste. So that will happen at the same time. And there are other sectors competing for this waste, but one of the sort of messages we're giving to government, those other sectors have alternatives. So for instance, ground transportation and the drive to biodiesel, they have alternatives. They can go the electric vehicle route and other routes. Aviation doesn't have an alternative, and I think it's good to see the Committee on Climate Change and the UK government now recognise that, and they will put in place incentives for aviation biojet.
I want to allow these last two questions, so this gentleman here and then we'll come to you.
Thank you, it's Mike Reed here. A quick comment and a quick question. As a humble member of the audience, the very first part of this debate about aviation I found very difficult to resolve because of the different graphs we were shown by Professor Peters, showing us a graph that showed tourism-related emissions meeting or even exceeding the maximum sustainable emissions that could be allowed. 100% of all emissions could be tourism-related. And then we saw another projection which showed that aviation-related emissions would stay at 2% of the global total in 40 years' time. And from an outsider's point of view, those two positions are so difficult to reconcile that I'm almost left with the decision of, which is more trustworthy, academia or industry, because they are so variant that from the outside point of view, it's very hard to draw anything from that part of the debate about which way one may conclude. The question built a little bit on an earlier question about those flight-based excursions. A carbon reduction policy strategy that's been used by other sectors is something called choice editing, where an industry or company will remove from their product offering those products they feel are at the black end of the spectrum, if you like, the most damaging. To give a perfectly mundane example, Wyvale Garden Centres decided to remove patio heaters from their product offering, replace them with something else. They consider them incompatible with their image as a forward-thinking green company. And I'm wondering to what extent the industry has yet considered this approach of removing from the holidays they sell or the flights they offer those which are the most damaging and replace them with less damaging.
Thanks, Mike. I think we've got the question. Let me just comment on the graphs, and then I'll come to James probably, I think, to answer on the choice editing. On the graphs, it's not surprising, is it, that forecasts are based on different assessments of what is likely to happen and what is likely to happen to the science. We're talking about projecting into the future. Now, both sides could spend a long time defending their graphs.
30 seconds.
I will let you have 30 seconds, but you are going to have the right to sum up as well. And we might actually do the graphs in the summing up, because we're very close to that. James, do you want to just deal with the choice editing question?
Sure. So, I mean, as a responsible tour operator, you know, we have set ourselves targets and commitments to try and increase the type and the volume of sustainability holidays, essentially, that we offer to our customers. And essentially, we are doing some of that choice editing on behalf of our customers. I mean, something around with regard to, say, hotels. We have a lot of differentiated hotels that we offer to our customers as part of our holiday packages. And, you know, we've set ourselves targets and we've taken steps to try and ensure that the customer has no less interesting, exciting, vibrant experience en route in destination, but which those hotels will operate more, let's say, leaner and meaner with regard to their environmental impact. So, I mean, these are steps that are being taken that have no impact on customer experience, but by which we can actually sort of take that step on the customer's behalf. But, you know, we take 30 million customers on holiday a year. We have a big challenge, and, you know, that's a challenge that we want to face and we're ready to face. So, choice editing will be a part of that solution.
Thanks, James. I'm just going to take the last question. The graph issue will be dealt with by both sides in their summing up.
My name is Vincent Ng, and I just wanted to say I very much enjoyed the debate. I do feel that the issue of sustainability is an incredibly huge one, and I think even though it was framed in the debate context, it's clear that, you know, from the private sector, from academia, all the folks on the panel today are very much concerned about the issue and are very much working toward looking at solutions for the future as well. I don't know if anyone's seen the film, the short film, The History of Stuff. If you have, just raise your hand. Just a quick poll. Okay, a few people. It's fascinating. Short, 10 minutes, 20 minutes long, and I think it illustrates a lot of the points and challenges around sustainability very succinctly. It's specifically looking at, you know, the process of just how we develop things from extraction to eventually consumerism. And it points to the whole concept of the golden arrow of consumerism driving everything else and all the choices that we make. And how the fact is, you know, you can walk into Walmart today and you can buy a tiny little radio that's, you know, £3, £4, and then you say, well, how is that possible? I mean, you know, is that the real cost?
Can I ask you to speed up?
So my question is, you know, the point from that film is that the real cost of externalities isn't actually priced into the goods we pay. And I find it challenging with discount airlines, for example, too, in terms of the choices I make, because it's so much cheaper to travel to, you know, for £30 to Edinburgh versus, you know, taking the rail. What can we be doing as an industry to put pressure on the real cost of externalities to the environment?
Shall I have a go at that?
I'm really tempted to answer, but I'm not allowed to, so please do.
Yeah, so carbon pricing is, I mean, for climate change, and there's other environmental impact, but for climate change, it is carbon pricing. So the quicker we can get to a globally carbon price scheme, so that every airline in the world pays for all its carbon, the quicker, the better. We support the EU emissions trading scheme as a first step in that direction, but it does create, because we're a globally competitive industry, it is competitive distorting, so it's bad news for people like BA, because we're going to pay for all our carbon when a lot of our competitors don't. So while we support it, our drive is to get to a global scheme as quickly as possible, and that way, when we get there, that's what's going to drive this next generation of technology. I mean, Boeing is not going to make low carbon planes just for British Airways and Lufthansa and Air France. They'll do it for a global market. So the quicker you can get to global pricing, carbon pricing applied to the airline industry, the quicker you get the manufacturers to make that next generation low carbon technology.
Paul, do you want to just say anything quickly on that?
Yeah, well, sorry about that. What I actually said that global carbon pricing, I do agree, of course, that is a good step. But in the end, if it really comes tough, then some others will suffer from that, and not small groups. So we must also look at the social aspects of that, which of course is part of social or sustainable development as well. And I have some worries there, but still, it's a way to start, sure.
Okay, I'm going to ask both sides to have just 3 minutes now to sum up. Then we'll go to the vote and we'll close. So, Paul, you go first.
I go first? Okay. First about the graph, the difference. I think what I showed was a really sustainable, sustainable world, avoiding dangerous climate change. And then you need the global emissions to go much further down than in any scenario of IPCC. And maybe that explains the difference. We have seen that there are 3 groups important in the whole discussion. That's the customer, the tourist, it's the industry, and it's the government. And I believe that do not expect from the customer that he will change his behavior if the other things don't change. So that's the first point. So what can the others do? The sector, well, the responsibility for airlines, railway companies, accommodations, that's to work on efficiency as they are doing. Actually, the railways weren't doing so much until, say, 10 years ago. So they have to take over quite a lot of what the airlines have done already. On the other hand, there are some railways, like the Swiss railways, they do already for decades a zero emission system because they generate their own hydropower and that's it. So fully zero emissions. And they just do it for economic reasons, by the way. Zero emission buildings, it's a reality already, but it's not very much in accommodation. So I really would say that hospitality should take up that challenge as an ultimate goal on the longer term. Then we have the integrators, like the tour operators, travel agencies. They really have a key in changing demand and through changing supply, and then of course market might follow. From long haul towards medium and short haul, and to develop coach and rail travel, which is not really an issue. Look at the recently, yesterday it was published, the global trends report. The whole word coach is not found in the report, 55 pages. Rail only 2 times, I think, and airlines at least 20 times. Climate change is not mentioned, environment is not mentioned, and, well, etc. So not in all elements of our industry there is this urge, or sense of urge for changing things. Finally, the sector needs, of course, economic and infrastructural support from governments. Well, the financial part we have talked about, but the infrastructural we didn't. Well, a little bit about the airport here, but it was not the kind of discussion I think we need. Look, for example, at China. Sometimes we say, oh, the Chinese do so much emissions, it doesn't matter what we do. But that's not true. Look at their schemes of building high-speed railways as well as airports, but they count at least at 2 horses. They are the lucky guys if things really become tough with carbon dioxide emissions. And then we just have to say, okay, we did make some mistakes here in our decisions. So all in all, I think there is still much more that the sector can and should do, so that it's not taking the full responsibility as was in the statement. For example, we should really start the discussion about demand, and that flying a little bit less, that would damage the industry in itself, which I really don't believe is the case. There is so much non-flying tourism that's unaffected by it, and then a little bit that has to change a little bit, not fully, but just a bit, will not destroy our industry, but we have to organize it different, and we have to think about it different and take other advantages.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. Can we pass now to Matt to sum up?
Great, thanks Harold. So I'll be brief, stick to my 3 minutes. I'm going to focus a bit on aviation because that's been a big theme of debate. It's the thing I know most about. I'll touch on the other areas. I'll just start by reiterating what I said at the beginning. A sustainable travel and tourism industry isn't just about hitting environmental targets. It's about having the economic, social, cultural wealth that aviation brings at the same time. And I do believe it's possible. I hope we've been able to set out today how we can have those benefits but at the same time tackle climate change. It's not a zero-sum game. We've heard a lot about choice editing, about the need to restrict some kinds of travel, long-haul travel, carbon intensive is in the frame a lot there. I don't think that's desirable. I don't think that's actually achievable politically either, actually. So I think we do need to look at another way of addressing this. Why isn't it desirable? For the wealth that I've outlined that the industry brings. I'm speaking to an industry of travel and tourism professionals here. But, personally, I've grown up in a generation which has been lucky enough to travel around Europe, travel around the world. Certainly in Europe, the fact that, without getting too kind of grandiloquent about it, the fact that, we live on a continent that hasn't seen, certainly in Western Europe, a major conflict for the last 40 or 50 years. I do think the fact that we can travel around that continent, yes, by rail, by car, but also by air, is a fundamental part of that, and further afield increasingly as well. I do think it's a good thing. And I think understandably people will want more of that. So I think the idea of choice editing, long-haul travel, which seemed to be where we were getting, of somehow restricting long-haul travel, I just think not desirable, not politically achievable. Let me just tackle the issue of the graphs, though. I'm just going to reiterate, recover the figures Jonathan mentioned. The Stern Review on climate change, the seminal, the landmark study said we need to get back by 2050 to 20 billion tonnes of CO2 globally. The aviation industry currently emits 700 million. Our commitment is a 50% cut in that by 2050, 300 million tonnes. The worst case scenario, if we don't achieve that, we're nowhere near it. There are no technological advances at all. Nothing's delivered from biofuels. We just carry on flying today's planes. Perhaps you get to about 2.5 billion tonnes. Still not more than around 10-12% of global emissions. It is more than today. But is that an unsustainable level, given that other sectors have much more opportunity to decarbonise? I don't think it is, actually. And just to the gentleman who was confused, I can understand some of the confusion. We'd only seen some of Harold's graphs as they flicked up on the computer today. We were rapidly... Sorry, not yours. Paul's graphs. We were trying to absorb them as well. I would just say, just in the UK context, again, our independent advisory body, the Committee on Climate Change, has looked at this and has said, yep, you can have 60% growth in aviation while still hitting long-term carbon targets to reduce by 80%. That's not the industry saying it. That's the government's independent advisors. I hope... The question on the table, just to sum up, is the industry taking responsibility? There's lots of debate about what a sustainable trajectory looks like in the long term, but I hope that at the very least we have been able to answer the question from an aviation, from a hotel, from a cruise and ground perspective, that I think we are taking this issue seriously. We are taking responsibility. Are we doing enough? I think Stephen's right. We will need to do more. We need to do more now. We will need to in future. But are we taking responsibility? I hope we've been able to convince you that we are. Thank you.
Thanks so much indeed. I'd like to go now to the vote. Javier, you counted last time, so if you do it again, it will reduce the error.
People left the room.
Yes, but this is true. I think what we'll ask, actually, is has anybody changed their mind as a result of this debate?
Oh, one person. At least one person, at least.
And then the right way, please.
We tried.
Yeah.
Tough audience, clearly. Just out of interest, actually, from my own interest, how many of you work in the travel and tourism industry? Well,
a little bit.
Okay. For a travel and tourism industry, that is a particularly tough audience to convince. I think it's fair to say. Wow.
I think. Let me just say two things in closing. I think one of the difficulties is that we hear very good things from the panelists about what the industry is doing. The question that ultimately matters is why more people in the industry aren't doing more. That's the fundamental question. And I think that's probably, to be honest, Matt, I think that's where some of the scepticism lies. We know that the good guys are doing a lot. The challenge is around all the people who are not moving at all. And I think that is not something that you can be held to account for. So don't feel too badly about it. And secondly, let me invite you all. I mean, you've just been the most fantastic audience today. You really have. I've never seen, wish my students were so attentive, to be honest, but I've never seen such an attentive audience. And when we clap the speakers in a minute, I think we should recognise that we're also clapping the audience. You've sat through what's been an intensely, I think probably exhausting debate if you're new to the issues. And to me, exhausting, and I'm not new to the issues. So, a lot's been going on, but please come and have a drink with the World Responsible Tourism Day reception, which is in Platinum 3 and 4, where the awards were this morning. There are some people already over there drinking your wine, so don't delay too long in getting over there. But I'd just like to thank the panel on your behalf, but also to say thank you to the audience for being so attentive and so interested. I'm really sorry you didn't swing anybody, but there we go. From experience, the drink will run out somewhere about 10 to 6, so don't delay too long going over there.